Hi, welcome back. My name is Sheldon McLeod. This is Thinking Out Loud, presented to you here exclusively by the Saltwire Network. And certainly front page news, the devastation, the impacts, $40 million rolled out for storm relief. Let's see, apartment debris hammers home. Lots of this type of information is available through media, and hopefully you have your power back on. If not, you probably will soon. Maybe, hopefully. Still 139,000 customers affected right across Nova Scotia. And I have to say, some areas absolutely were more impacted by others. That's what happens most times with a natural disaster like this. But I guess in the end, we want to know how well did this province respond, the governance of the province. People, and I've said this before, people tend to come together in times of crisis, and they are there for each other. And I was thinking of the example of the missing 4-year-old in the height of a hurricane, and there were all sorts of people willing to give up their time to help bring that little boy back home. I wanted to hear from Kevin Quigley. Kevin Quigley is a scholarly director of the McCachran Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and he has been involved with, Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative at Dalhousie University. And Kevin Quigley joins me now. It's good to see you again, sir. Thank you so much for this.
Thanks for having me.
And as mentioned, comfort centers are still open. People are still struggling to get streets cleared and power back on. Is it too soon to give a grade as to how the province has responded or prepared for this natural disaster?
Yes, I think, well, yes and no. Like most questions, it's always a bit of this yes and a bit of no, I suppose. I think that we can look at, for example, how did they prepare in the days leading up to the event, and I think they did a pretty good job. I mean, people often talk about Hurricane Juan as a point of reference or a point of comparison. I think we're light years ahead of where we were then. We've learned a lot. I think they did a much better job of using the media and communicating, when there was about 72 hours before the storm to say something big was probably coming. People had to get ready. And then you saw the impact that people were going to grocery stores and buying groceries and stocking up and things like that. So I think they're much more adept at using media and getting the word out. I think also the weather forecasts were pretty accurate. So they did a good job there. They also had comfort centers set up, because you don't really want to set those centers up in the middle of the crisis. So I think there's a lot of good progress in terms of how we get ready in advance. Now we've entered into a phase. Well, actually, there are kind of a couple of dimensions to what's been going on the last few days. I think you then enter into this sort of crisis response period, which is different from getting everybody ready, because now you're actually having to cope with what's going on. And so I think we're in that phase, and I think we're focused largely on that emergency response piece and getting the power back up and running, getting the cell phone towers working, managing supply chain issues, comfort to those people who are vulnerable, et cetera. So I think that's a separate phase from getting people ready in advance. And so it's hard to be even super critical at this stage, because I think everybody's doing their best and they're putting their shoulder into it. And I think it's hard to actually be super critical, which is one of the tricky things about working in this area, Sheldon, that when the crisis is occurring, you want to be supportive, but there's got to be some sort of accounting afterwards too about, well, what happened? What did we do well? What did we not do well? How do we do better next time? We're on a hurricane path. These things are going to happen. We have to keep learning in a certain way and doing better. So in terms of grade, I would say, yeah, it's too early to talk about grade. We have to be transparent in our learning, I think, as we go forward. And that's going to have to happen. But right now it's about supporting people in this crisis and making sure we're giving aid to those people who need it, and also getting those power lines back up and that critical infrastructure functioning again.
And to your point of Hurricane Juan, I could probably count on one hand the number of politicians who might still be in office now who were in office then. So when does that reckoning happen? When do we hold those folks to account for either challenges or mistakes or even perhaps shortcomings, and to try and affect change for the next time? Because there was a lot of concern over Dorian and the impact on communications. So where do we go from there? How do we do that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. It's a really important one. When is it appropriate to start asking some of the tougher questions? And we're starting to see it now. I mean, people are starting to ask questions on the telecom side, for example. because there were problems with telecoms failures the last time around, and there were problems with lack of backup systems. And then we have a problem again with telecoms this time around. And so there are a couple of things that I would say about telecoms as far as we know. The problem is with telecoms is that it's absolutely crucial for successful emergency response, for people who are in emergency response, but actually the community as a whole. We're very, very dependent on our cell phone technology. And so if it doesn't work, people start doing things that you don't want them to do, right? So they start going out and trying to connect with a cell phone tower somewhere else. And so when they're supposed to be sheltering in place, they're actually off on the street doing stuff they shouldn't be doing. So it kind of creates these sort of cascading effects and problems, and then it disrupts emergency services from doing their jobs and that sort of stuff because there are too many cars on the road and things like that. So on the question of, when do we start holding people to account? I mean, I think in some respects you have to start leveraging the opportunities that present themselves. So the federal government seems to be very open to helping Atlantic Canada in tough times, and so it should. And some of that is about, providing military support, and some of it is about providing funding. But we do have to start asking these questions about telecoms, because telecoms is federally regulated. And so we have to start asking, what are we doing to provide a more reliable network during these crises? Because as I say, in the case of hurricanes, we're going to have them from time to time. This isn't a one-off. People will often think in this sort of crisis space that when they have these experiences, it's such a unique situation. And sometimes people can use that almost as an excuse to hide behind, we didn't see it coming. How could we have? But in Atlantic Canada, we're in a hurricane path. Every few years, we're going to have major events. Some will be bigger than others. We still have these events. So we need to learn and we need to improve. So I think that the pressure can start now. We are starting to ask some questions of telecoms. And I think we also need to leverage the opportunities with the federal government's listening and start to apply pressure, because in a few weeks' time, the attention will dissipate and it'll be more difficult to seize opportunities, because, very few people want to talk about emergency response on a sunny day in July. And we get attention in these particular moments, and it's kind of constrained right now because it's all about emergency response. But really good emergency response does depend on good planning, and that has to happen months and years in advance. So there's really no reason why we should be applying the pressure pretty soon, and we need good data, reliable data, honest account, commitment to learning, all of those kind of characteristics that will lead to improvement. That's what we need. And the public needs to have access to this information. We need a public accounting of what's been going on.
I thought it was telling that during Hurricane Dorian, there were challenges with communications. And at the time, the premier of the day, Stephen McNeil, said he would hope that the communications companies, that people with those agencies were inside the Emergency Operations Center. And a reporter asked that question just the other day, and that did not happen this time. It's a different premier. It's a different party in government. I assume it's many of the same people, though, inside of those emergency operations, the similar bureaucrats who may have some, firsthand knowledge of what happened then and what happened this time. And that's where I question where, those are, for the most part, people who don't put their names on ballots. They're not reachable through most of the democratic mechanisms that we have. You can't pull a lever and change who those folks are at the telecom. So where does that, how do we rationalize, or how do we rectify that in our minds to get it to work?
So this is another interesting dimension to emergency response. But the example that always comes to me, it's a different space, a different sort of challenge. But when I think about the 2013 Alberta floods, for example, and when that flooding occurred, there were questions about insurance and who had insurance and who didn't, and whether or not the state should pay for various damages. And the government at the time agreed to pay for those damages, but said they wouldn't be doing it again. But you see, the thing is, then those politicians are gone. The next time these events happen 5, 10, 20 years later, it's a new, group of politicians. The political pressures are the same. The media scrutiny is the same. And so they need answers. And as I say, we end up responding to these things almost in a sort of, in a crisis context, which isn't necessarily the most sensible way to reply to long-standing problems and challenges that we have with our infrastructure. However, it does create some opportunities. But anyway, I take your point, and I think it's a good one. The politicians go, and then the political pressures will be the same for a new incoming group. And so you do wonder, when we think about telecoms, I think it's a fair question to ask. I mean, it's privately owned, it's federally regulated. And they've had some recent challenges, not just around emergency response, but around network failure. It's such a crucial system for us. Do we need to be applying more pressure? I mean, the benefit of the system that we have is that you do have institutional memory, that we have the capacity to brief incoming elected officials to say, this is what did happen, this is what we did commit to, and this is where we're at. So kind of stable public service, although those public servants aren't on any kind of election cycle, they're protected. They do give us a corporate memory that elected officials can exploit when they're in charge. I mean, that's just simply the way our system works. The question now, I suppose, is to apply pressure to those elected officials, to apply pressure to learn what they can and make the appropriate decision, good decisions right now, to apply to those owners and operators of critical infrastructure. But I mean, the fact is they're privately owned, and we need to apply pressure and hold them to account. They're running a critical service for our community, absolutely critical. It needs to work.
I guess the last point would be, as we pointed out, Nova Scotia Power, they brought in crews from around the region to try and help, clear the streets, get the lines back up, get the power restored. At the same time, just a few weeks ago in its rate hike application, the utilities suggested they should be given extra funds to deal with potential storms, that they should have the ability to pass that on through to consumers. And I'm wondering, when we're talking about protecting infrastructure, we're talking about trying to bring accountability. Does that in any way fly in the face of what your teachings are, what your experience is, that saying that a company that with legislation is a monopoly, a utility, an essential service, who then says, well, these cost pressures aren't ones that we should bear. It should be on the consumer. And I'm curious if that's something that you've thought about.
I think in these kinds of situations, what you would do is they would have to make a business case to justify that kind of request. But I think this is exactly why the government needs to use its authority to apply pressure on the service provider to increase standards. And so there's a bit of a give and take. If these costs go up, I think that we have to be grown-ups about this and say, look, the infrastructure needs to be resilient. We want better infrastructure. You got to pay for it. But it can't be a blank check where you just simply say, okay, we would take their word for it that, here's your check and go and fix these systems. If there are failings, we need to know there's improved performance and we can hold them to standards, and that's publicly available information. And it just seems like in the past with some of the CI sectors, the transparency piece hasn't always been there, and after the events occur. So if they want better infrastructure and they feel that they have to pass those costs on to the users, I think that could be a reasonable request. I don't think we have to be unreasonable about that, but I think you have to get something for it too. And we need to know there's going to be better service performance before there's any additional funding.
Anything else that Professor Quigley wants to add before we conclude?
I guess one of the things I've been thinking about is that just in terms of reference to Hurricane Juan, for example, we do tend to think about the last disaster and crisis. I think that's fair game. You look at Dorian, you say, what happened with telecoms? Why weren't there any improvements? I think that's a fair question to ask. We are on a hurricane path. These things are going to keep happening, so we have to keep learning. We have to commit ourselves to learning and improvement in that way. But I think the other thing for us to think about is, how is our risk profile changing? Right? I think this is an important consideration. So it's not all about how did we do in Dorian and do we learn those lessons? We have an aging population. We have a largely rural population, although we're becoming increasingly urbanized. We've got more high rises that are occurring. There's an increased dependence on technology. So we have to be sensitive to the ground as it's changing beneath us. And how do we accommodate those issues, I think, as we go forward? I think the other thing that maybe is worth the harder questions we're going to be asking ourselves, very sensitive issues as time goes on, is where do we build, how do we build, and who pays for it? So it's a bit like an extension of the telecoms discussion. When you go into communities that are on the coast, people like living on the coast. We are a coastal community. There's a lot of good reasons for living on the coast, but some of those properties are vulnerable. And so another industry that we've been working with in this space over time is the insurance industry, to say what is appropriate insurance coverage that people should have, who can get it. It's not usually possible to get coverage if you're in such an exposed area. So how do we address some of those issues? So there's some properties that have been devastated. How do we have a reasonable response, but also build back better and more intelligently? And who takes financial responsibility? I don't want to sort of suggest at this point that you don't support communities that are devastated. Of course you do. But we do have to have sensible conversations about not building in highly vulnerable places, and also assigning some degree of responsibility where people pay for insurance for the risk that they're taking. That's the way, normally insurance works. So we need to have some of those conversations. Those are hard conversations to have. I know that the Premier of Newfoundland was talking about that yesterday, but some of those properties were in highly vulnerable spaces. So part of the Build Back Better concept is thinking about the risks to which people are going to be exposed, and how do we move forward through uses of insurance and public insurance, private insurance, and also sensible planning, and try to manage those risks a little bit differently in the future. I think those are important questions that we're going to be facing on the other side of this.
Lots to consider. And he is a scholarly director with McCackern Institute for Public Policy and Governance, and had founded the Critical Infrastructure Protection Initiative at Dalhousie University. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.